What's going on, gunfighters? Saddle up for another episode of Gunfighter Life, the podcast where we talk about gunfighting the right way, with God at the center, Judeo-Christian values, and real-world first-hand experience. I am your host, Michael Melito. I'll do an abbreviated bio since this is going to be a shorter episode. First and foremost, I am a Christian, a servant of God, and a follower of Jesus Christ. Also a Marine Corps combat veteran, 2 tours in Iraq. Also served in the U.S. Army, full-time and part-time National Guard. Been a private contractor for a 3-letter government agency. Been the commander of a tactical team to stop active shooters. Been a professional big game hunter and guide, and been blessed to be a state rifle and pistol champion. But the primary thing that I am is a servant of God, made in His very own image. With that, what cartridge are we going to talk about today? The 8mm Remington Magnum. Don't you mean 7mm Rem Mag? No, I don't. I mean the 8mm Remington Magnum. There's a certain subset of the population out there that really likes these obscure cartridge talks, to better know a cartridge talks. Well, I've been thinking about this one for a day or two, and what a cool cartridge. And you may initially think 8mm Remington Magnum, maybe they took the 7 Rem Mag, which is a very popular cartridge, and necked it up. People do that all the time. But that's not what they did here. The 8mm Rem Mag is not a necked up version of a 7 Rem Mag. It's its own thing. Kind of like the, 10mm and the 9mm. They're 1mm apart, but vastly different cartridges. This is a vastly different cartridge as well. I should also mention that this is the very first cartridge talk we're going to do with a brand new book. If you've listened for any length of time, you know I often use the Hornady Reloading Manual, edition number 8. I've had that thing a long time. But thanks to one of the patrons, I've been blessed with Cartridges of the World, and I was flipping through that tonight. And I found the cartridge I was looking for, the 8mm Remington Magnum. So this cartridge came out in 1978, so it's not a new kid on the block. She's been around a while. Introduced by Remington, obviously, it's the Remington Magnum, and for their 700 BDL. Now the 8mm Remington Magnum is derived from the 375 H&H, the old 375 Holland. Legendary African big game hunting cartridge. The 375 Holland has a reputation all its own. It's a very storied cartridge with a great history and a great reputation. And they took this cartridge and they, what's referred to as blew it out. That basically means they took a tapered cartridge and gave it less or no taper and more powder capacity. You'll see this real common on like an Ackley cartridge, like the 280 Ackley Improved. It's a 280, but Ackley Improved. They blow out the sidewalls, give it less taper. They also may reform the shoulder. All that being said, it usually gives it a little bit more capacity, improves the ballistics a little bit. And that's what they did with the 375 Holland. It's already a powerhouse and a beastly cartridge, let's just say that. And then they necked it down. Instead of taking another cartridge and necking it up, they necked the 375 H&H down to 8mm. And 8mm, if anybody's familiar with 8mm, they're probably familiar with the 8 Mauser, right? That's the most common one. And that, sadly, may have been what doomed this cartridge to obscurity. Americans just aren't hip on the 8mm. It took us a really, really long time to get down with the 6.5mm. Now we love them. But the 6.5x55 Swede came out in the 1800s. And look at it on paper, it's very ballistically similar to the 6.5 Creedmoor. So it took us, over 100 years to get on that train? And who knows how long to get on the 8mm train. I think it's an underutilized caliber in America for sure. A lot of other countries use it, German especially. But we don't really have a lot of love for the 8mm, and that might have doomed this cartridge prematurely, because I think it's a good cartridge. Now I'll caveat this with saying I don't own any Magnum rifles. You may think that I do, especially being a professional big game hunter and guide and like a professional buffalo hunter, but I don't. I get all my stuff done with standard rifle calibers. 308 is the biggest rifle caliber I own. But that doesn't mean I don't see a place or a point to the Magnum calibers. This case is quite a bit bigger. This is a beefier cartridge, not just 1mm different diameter. It's a much beefier cartridge than the 7mm Remington Magnum. And you're obviously throwing heavier bullets, right? At least in general, you can get really light 8mm bullets. You can get really heavy 7mm bullets. But in general, you're throwing heavier bullets, heavier projectiles downrange. That's kind of the point, right, of the 8mm Rem Mag. Heavier projectiles, bigger case, more power. I think this would be a great, let's say, underutilized Alaskan game cartridge. It would even be a great western Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, that region. Kind of overkill in the southwest, but great in that region, where you don't need an 8mm Remington Magnum to shoot an elk. I've taken plenty with a 243, but there are bears there that might want to eat you. So maybe you're not necessarily so concerned about the cartridge to take down the elk, but the cartridge to take down the bear after you've returned to that elk to get the rest of the meat and there's a giant gut pile with a bear on it that doesn't like you there. Or any number of scenarios. Be a fine moose cartridge with proper bullet construction or things like that. A big beefy animal. Now let's look at some numbers on the 8mm Remington Magnum. Let's get nerdy. Kind of the one that I would go to is a heavy for caliber for this projectile. 220 grain soft point at 2830. If you think about those numbers, that's similar to what a 30-06 308 is going to launch. And these are round numbers, right? So not exactly. So don't get all bent out of shape. But roughly the same velocity a 30-06 or a 308 is going to launch a 150 grain bullet. This is launching a 220 grain bullet. That's a beast of a bullet at a respectable velocity. Let's look at a 185 grain. Over 3,000 feet a second. Let's look at a 200 grain. Still a beefy bullet. That's over 3,000 feet a second in a 200 grain bullet. 30-50 with 200 grains. That's a beefy bullet. If you drop down to a traditional bullet weight for a lot of other calibers, 150 grain, you're looking at 3,300 feet a second. But again, I don't think I would go that route. If I was going to get 8mm Rem Mag, I would go with the heavier bullets. That's kind of the point. The obvious next thing we're going to compare this to, right, is the 7mm Rem Mag. So let's look at that. 7mm Rem Mag, we left off with a 150 grain bullet. Here we have a 150 grain bullet at 3,000. Remember, the other one, the 8mm, is at 3,300. And this tops out at 175 grain. And that 175 grain is launched out of that 7 Rem Mag, at least the numbers in this page. 175 grain at 2860. And that's really close to the 220 grain at 2830 out of the 8mm. So you're going from 175 to 220 grains with roughly the same velocity. And to reiterate, I think a big reason why this cartridge didn't take off, and this is my speculation, is the same reason, the 260 Remington, which is a great cartridge and has quite a following in a small community, but it never really took off. I think people weren't ready for that caliber. They just weren't crazy for the 6.5mm at the time. They are now, but it wasn't introduced at the right time. The 6.5 Creedmoor came along at the right time, when laser rangefinders were a thing and long-range shooting where affordable rifles could be really accurate. When that started to be a thing and good glass was a thing, it came in at the right time. I think the 8mm came in at a time, and I think we're still in that time, sadly, where the 8mm, it's just not really thought of as an American cartridge. Nobody's clamoring for 8mm, right? We're predominantly 30 caliber hunters, and we've kind of accepted the 8mm and the 6.5, but really 30 cal is the American market, and a lot of people are going to go to the 300 Win Mag. It's who knows how many times more popular than the 8mm Remington Magnum. So that 8mm Remington Magnum, kind of doomed to obscurity. You know, in fact, it's Wildcat, ironically. 7mm Child, if we can call it that, is actually more popular, I think. And we already did a cartridge talk on that you can go listen to. That's the 7mm STW, Shooting Times Westerner. You may think, why would Remington introduce a cartridge like that, an 8mm, and then somebody else wildcats it down to 7mm? Why wouldn't Remington do that? Well, because it'd probably be confusing, right? And they probably didn't want to compete with the sales of their already popular 7mm Remington Magnum. What are they going to call it? The 7mm Magnum, right? They could come up with some whiz-bang name, but they probably didn't want to compete with their already popular 7 Rem Mag. But somebody else looked at that case and said, hey, that's pretty cool. It wouldn't take much to, and relatively, right? You can't just take a pair of pliers and squeeze it down. But relatively speaking, that's bigger and beefier than the 7 Rem Mag. Why not neck that down to 7mm? And they did, and that's the 7mm Shooting Times Western. Or as I was, Shooting Times Westerner. And that's a really good round. I have seen that around. I have run into that in my professional hunting time. It's not super popular, not like the 7 Rem Mag, but it is more popular, I think, ironically, than the parent case, the 8mm Remington Magnum. But that doesn't make it not a good cartridge. And if you see a rifle chambered in it and you're going to do that kind of hunting caveat and you reload, or you don't mind spending a premium on ammo or getting it ahead of time, because you're probably not running into it at Walmart, right? But it's a great cartridge and it has good numbers. There's nothing wrong with that. And 8mm might not be super popular here, but in Europe and Africa and places like that, 8mm is nowhere near as obscure, which means the projectiles are made, and you can probably get some really good, properly constructed projectiles for whatever you want to hunt. Elk, moose, bear, right? You could get a myriad of different projectiles for that if you hand load. So I think it's a really cool cartridge that just sadly I think was doomed from the get-go to not be really popular. Anyway, with that, that's my thoughts on the 8mm Rem Mag. She's not a bad girl. She's just really unpopular. Tactical tip of the day. This is primarily a hunting cartridge, so I'm going to give you a tactical tip, not really anything to do with hunting. But if you are traveling, or even if you're not, and you're a preparedness-minded individual, you might want to consider, even if you're going to change your pants the next day, when you take your pants off for the night, keeping all your EDC stuff and everything in there, and either putting the pants down like firemen do, you know, where they're ready to jump in and go if your shoes will allow that, or hanging them up somewhere near the bed. If you get some kind of bump in the night, there's nobody in the house or in the hotel room, but you just don't, you know, something's just not right. You get that gut feeling that something's amiss. You can grab those pants and put them on quick instead of, you know, finding your pants and then finding your flashlight and finding your holster and then, you know, finding your knife and your wallet and all that stuff. You can literally just grab the pants. I have a weight room real close to the bed in the house, and I literally just hang my pants up right there. Especially if I'm traveling and I may have to get ready quickly, right? I can literally just grab the pants and put them on. And everything's already oriented the correct way. All my pants, all my belt. I don't have to worry about any of that stuff. It greatly reduces the amount of time. Let's call it reaction time. So you may want to consider doing that. Like I said, even if you're going to change your pants, the next day you can literally just grab a new pair of pants and put all the stuff on the pants. You're not going to lose really any time by not taking them off the night before, but if you have to throw them on again really quickly, it may take a lot longer if all that stuff's not together or already on the pants. Anyway, that's your tactical tip of the day. The tactical verse of the day is coming at you from Proverbs 21. A person may think their own ways are right, but the Lord weighs the heart. To do what is right and just is more acceptable to the Lord than sacrifice. Haughty eyes and a proud heart, the unplowed field of the wicked produce sin. The plans of the diligent lead to profit as surely as haste leads to poverty. A fortune made by a lying tongue is a fleeting vapor and a deadly snare. With that, men, thank you for listening, and have a blessed day.